Thanks everyone for joining us today. And I am recording this session for fellows who can't join, just so everyone knows. We're really happy to be joined today by Jennifer Talken-Spaulding. Jennifer currently serves as the National Park Service Bureau Cultural Anthropologist within the Office of Tribal Relations and American Cultures, or TRAC. She manages the nationwide cultural anthropology program and oversees the National Park Service's Park, NAGPRA, and Tribal Historic Preservation programs. Jennifer has degrees in anthropology from Western Michigan University and George Mason University, where she completed fieldwork on authenticity, place, heritage areas, and the identification of urban ethnographic resources. She's worked for the Park Service since 1995 in national parks and programs in Montana, the Southwest, California, Hawaii, the Mid-Atlantic, and Washington, D.C. And thank you again so much for joining us today, Jennifer. I thought if it's okay with you, we could just get started by having the fellows that are on here today introduce themselves and their projects briefly, and then also why they're interested in what they want to hear from you or talk to you about today. And then I will turn it over to you to share a little bit about the programs that you work on. So
yeah, that sounds
thanks so
good.
much.
And I'm glad to join you all here today. I'm looking forward to speaking with you. I'm just going to give you a little bit of a forewarning that I am on the tail end of like a cold cough, and my doctor gave me some medicine earlier today. So if I have to pause for coughing, I apologize for that, but we'll do the best we can. So, but yeah, I look forward to hearing from you, and we can make this conversation however best, suits your needs. And yeah, that's good. Thanks.
So I guess, Michelle, I see you on my screen. Would you mind starting us off?
Not at all. I'm Michelle Nightpipe. I'm working on the Pipestone Boarding School Truth and Education Fellowship. And I'm really excited to have an anthropologist leading a session. I'm also an anthropologist, and I just want to learn whatever you have to offer. I want to learn.
And I turn it over to Kelly next. I see you too on my screen, if that's okay.
Yes, that's fine. Hi, my name is Kelly Barnes. I'm at Independence National Historical Park in Philadelphia, working on the Reframing Our Nation's Origin Story project, concentrating on African American studies. And I am focused on telling the narratives of Black Americans in the 18th century, primarily, and I am here to learn. I am a historian by training. Thank you.
Okay, I see that. I think Sarah Buckmeyer is listening in, and so she just said she doesn't want to disrupt her workplace, but that Sarah is at Lowell National Historical Park working on developing new interpretive themes for the Boot Cotton Mills exhibit, and looking forward to hearing more about your work. Thank you, Sarah. Can I turn it over to Bree? Is that okay? Next.
Yeah, hi, I'm Bree Romanello. I am a cultural anthropologist, specifically trained in ethnography, and I'm at Anza Trail. So yeah, I'm just really excited to learn more about how anthropology and that research is translated and depicted, and like what methods are used. So that's really exciting for me. I'm to nerd out here with all of you.
Thanks, Bree. Beth, would you mind introducing yourself next?
Sure. I'm Beth Cruz. I'm a historian. I'm at Vicksburg National Park, where I'm working at the African American Experience. I'm a multidisciplinary historian, so anthropology is important, and I'm just interested in what you're going to say that I can apply. Thank you.
I think you're on mute, Eleanor.
Oh, sorry. I was saying, I think Sarah Montoya is the last fellow.
Sure. Howdy, folks. Sorry, I'm off camera today. My name is Sarah Montoya, and I'm also a fellow for the Anza Trail National Historic Trail. My background is in gender studies at UCLA, where I worked with a lot of folks in American Indian studies and tribal communities and projects like Mapping Indigenous LA. So part of the work that I'm hoping to do for the Anza Trail is to both build relationships with tribal communities along the space and corridor as we work to build digital humanities projects that really broaden the narratives represented through the National Park Service.
Thanks, everyone. And I'll turn it over to you now, Jennifer.
Okay, that sounds great. Well, first of all, I'm really glad to know that there's, I'm glad to know your backgrounds. You know, it's nice to always know that there's a couple of anthropologists sprinkled into the audience when we're talking about the topic. Historians and cross-disciplinary people, you know, it's all related. My background, in my undergraduate was anthropology at a double major of anthropology and women's studies. And so I hear you too, Sarah, and the work that you're doing. So, and also it's nice to know where you're at, because I and the program have had some relationships with, I think, pretty much every one of the places that you're at. And I'm glad to know the two of you are at Anza Trail. There's some exciting stuff happening out there with the planning. And of course, the boarding school projects are, you know, really a big topic right now. And I think I might have even looked at some of the early things that you guys were thinking about for Pipestone. So lots of good stuff here. You know, I have some slides. I was debating about whether or not to use them, but it might be good to just use them for a little bit of introduction, if that's good for you guys, and then we can just kind of go from there. It's a slideshow. I have kind of various different ways that we've done this over the years. This one was one that we did with the Northeast region superintendents last fall, but so I won't do the whole thing, but it will be, and in order to get it to work on Teams, I have to make sure I have it on the right window. Share this. Now, I hope this works. Yes, you're seeing
Looks
it.
good. Looks
Okay.
good.
So I'm going to just kind of go through to give you a little bit of background about the anthropology program and what are ethnographic groups, traditionally associated people, and ethnographic resources in parks, because that is really kind of the topic and I think where your interests, where our intersections are going to be. So the anthropology program was established in 1981. So we've been doing this work for a long time in the National Park Service. And the National Park Service is one of the few agencies that actually has a cultural anthropology or applied anthropology program. That the purpose of which is to really help parks and people make those connections. So this is making the connections between park management and people who have a deep tie to the lands that we manage. So I always sort of describe it as, you know, this is the beyond the general public. This is beyond the recreational user. These are people that have a deep tie to the lands that we now happen to manage. So who are those traditionally associated communities? Traditionally associated groups are defined in our management policies for the National Park Service. And it is groups that are cultural communities whose members regard those resources as essential to their cultural identity and existence. And that association has endured for at least 2 generations. And that association began prior to the establishment of the park. And we do definitely work with cultural communities and groups of people that are, you know, kind of on the edge of this, maybe not Maybe they're a new cultural community that has moved into an area, especially in an urban area. And so they don't necessarily have that pre-park establishment tie, but they're still important to the understanding of how people are using resources and are interested in experiencing their cultural. Sometimes it's using resources for cultural ceremonies that really had nothing to do with the park, but that's what they are now. So anthropology helps to see that, and interpret that to park managers. Okay. There we go. Okay, so once you know what the group is, then what is the ethnographic resource? So again, the definition in our NPS guideline, the Cultural Resource Guideline, NPS 28, is an ethnographic resource is a site, a structure, an object, a landscape, natural resource, or a feature that is assigned traditionally legendary, religious, subsistence, or other significance for a cultural group. So that's that deep connection. And the picture that I have here is Acadia National Park, and it's the sweetgrass, which is one of the traditional Wabanaki sweetgrass gatherers are working with the park, and the park's been working with them to do a number of things over the past few years about maintenance of sweetgrass. They've done ethnobotany studies about sweetgrass, and they're about to start to do a plant gathering agreement. They're approaching that so that they can have the gatherers gathering for traditional purposes within Acadia. So the ethnographic resource can be anything really in a park. It can include museum objects. It really is what is the tie, the deep tie. I'm going to come back to that in a second. So here's another way of saying that in the guideline is that it's really any type of natural resource or cultural resource that we manage within a park. And the decision to call it ethnographic depends on the associated group's perspective and that traditional tie. So the only way that we know that we have ethnographic resources in a park is if we ask, if we talk to people, if we understand who those communities are, and we understand what their association is with the park. So now I'm going to go back to this other slide because, people generally think about, one of the first things that people think about is tribes and tribal connections, and that's an obvious one. Tribes have also a different level of association and a different relationship, which we can talk about a little bit more. But the anthropology program is broadly looking at cultural communities. And so one big level of work and community engagement that the Park Service has been doing for many years is with African American descendant communities at parks all across the country. And this is just an image of an article that was actually written in Essence magazine that was going on at Monocacy National Battlefield, where it started archaeology project, it turned into a genealogy project, and that turned into communicating about descendants of people that had been enslaved at Monocacy and letting them learn more about that story that the Park Service had been growing to understand through their research projects. So this was a fascinating multi-year kind of a project that has been going on. Where do you find out, information? Where do you find out about the past ethnographic research that has been completed, or maybe the current ethnographic research that's being completed? We have a system in the National Park Service that's in the past. So our first article about this was by my predecessor, Mickey Crosby, back. This article is from 1987, but it was the Ethnographic Resources Inventory, and it was our first attempt at trying to take some of the information of that that we had in reports and put it into a system that was more easily accessible for Park Service staff. And the current version is the Cultural Resources Inventory System. So CRIS is what we moved the ERI data into CRIS. CRIS is a program platform. It has archaeology, cultural landscapes, historic structures, and ethnographic resources all in the same platform. And this is our database of record. So when we do ethnographic research in the National Park Service, one of the end results is that any new associations or any additional information that we learn from traditional communities about condition or treatment of ethnographic resources, and in particular, any new ethnographic resources that are identified, need to be added into the system so that when people are in parks are doing management processes, they can look it up and see who they need to consult with. So that is something that if you are stationed in a park, we can get you access. I will tell you that it's only as good as the information that goes in it, right? Like any database system. And our database system, there was a gap from the old ERI to the current CRIS of over 10 years, about almost 10 to 12 years, where the other archaeology, landscapes, and historic structures, those databases were continued to be supported and matured and had data entry, but there was over a decade where the anthropology program did not have national program leadership until I was hired in 2015. So we are still kind of catching up and trying to put in data, and so some regions are more further along than other regions are. People, sort of ask sometimes, like, why do we do this work? Why do we need to talk to communities? We talk to the general public. We do public open houses. We do, consultation with tribes. We do consultation with consulting parties through a Section 106 process when we have projects. Like, what more do we need to do? And I always like to just kind of remind people that there's a number of pieces of legislation in addition to the Park Service's own policy, management policies, policy memos, director's orders, and so forth, that specifically mention traditionally associated people. So it is important because we do want to try and understand that, again, that deeper connection that people have, so that can be included when we are making management decisions. And more recently, the policy memo, there's a Secretary's Order 3403, and the new policy memo on co-stewardship, which I helped to draft last year, were sort of taking this one more step about when we're talking about tribal places or places of significance to Alaska Natives or Native Hawaiians. This administration is very interested in helping and encouraging people to, I say, think about how to get to yes. Like, if there was ways that we wish that we could work together, how do we get to yes? Yes, we can do that. And so these two pieces of policy were put together to try and help frame up some support. So co-stewardship is a big umbrella. It can be anything from collaboratively designing interpretive messaging, and it can go all the way to land management. or co-management, but co-management is a legislated process. So co-management, you can't just up and do because there's a little bit of responsibility that the agency gives up to whoever you are co-managing with, and that is outlined in law. That relationship. And we have a couple of places in the Park Service that do that. So this picture is Werowocomoco, which is in Virginia, and is a really important and sacred place for several of the federally recognized tribes that are in the state of Virginia. And it is a co-stewardship area for sure, and one that they have been doing co-planning for many years. There's a slide here, and I'll probably just highlight this. I'll drop this in the chat for you. The Native American Affairs SharePoint site is probably the most useful link on here because pretty much all this other stuff is on there for legislation, policy guidance, on-demand training, all that kind of stuff is here. We launched the SharePoint site last year at the same time that the policy memo came out. And ethnography aids in understanding, as I say, ethnographic groups, just to kind of recap, ethnographic groups, who the groups are, what are the resources that they value, how do we engage with them. It helps us to answer resource questions that we may have. This is where traditional knowledge or indigenous knowledge can come into play. Condition, treatment recommendations, change over time, impacts of climate on resources that have been observed, all of that can come into play. Planning and stewardship and consultation are all bundled up together in once you know the people and you know the resources that they value and you've built that relationship over time, then you can kind of move into that next step, which is application into active management. Just a final slide here that we were involved in again, this was up at Acadia. This was a archaeological advisory committee meeting that met several years ago, but they have since continued to meet, and there's several of the people that are in here that are part of the Sweetgrass Gathering group too. So, and there's TIPOs and park staff and a little bit of everybody in that image. Okay, so I'm going to stop sharing my screen and come back on camera so I can see you all again. And what I should do is I'll drop the, let me get back to that. Think about a question, think about questions you may have while I grab the SharePoint site link and drop it in the chat for you. And, you know, I like 2 screens, but after a while you're like, wow, that's a lot to manage. So there we go. So that's just kind of an overview. So, you know, it kind of gives you some framework about where the program is, who we work with, which is a variety of people from fishermen to, you know, descendant communities to tribal communities. We do actively have, we have a regional anthropologist in every region. So, and that is on our website, the contacts for all the regional anthropologists. We do have regular meetings. And if any of you want to join on our service-wide anthropologist email group, just send me a note and I can add you in. We have meetings every other month. And our next one is actually going to be in November. And it's mostly a time for us to just kind of talk about just kind of things that are going on and what people are working on. We actually, the Society for Applied, I'm just kind of going a little riff here, but the Society for Applied Anthropology is having its annual meeting in March. Generally, we have a long relationship between the Park Service program and SFAA because we are an applied anthropology program. And I will actually, I have a panel that I'm organizing of anthropologists in the federal workforce. And we have a couple other panels that are going to focus on Park Service projects at that conference. It's going to be in Santa Fe at the end of March. So that is another opportunity if you guys have training dollars and you're interested, and you may want to come to SFAA. We're not going to have, sometimes we have like an annual meeting of the anthropologists at SFAA. We're not going to do that this year. Because really it's the first time we're all going to get together in person since before COVID. The last one we were all together at was in Portland in 2019. So this has been a long time. So we're not going to do a big meeting. We're just going to, whoever's going to be there, we'll just, support each other's presentations and go out for lunch or something like that. So that's coming up. I can drop that link into for SFAA. But I'll pause there to see if there are questions or reactions. Go ahead, Brittany. Bree.
Thank you. Appreciate it. I don't know how to get rid of the hand. Sorry. I just had a really quick question. If you could, I know it's kind of a broad question, so maybe just speaking from your experience. So you said a couple of times and showed an example of like co-stewardship in projects. I'm just wondering, like, since NPS is such a highly regulated institution of power, that may have some crossover with like my academic training, right, or yours, but it's still different, right? What does developing and implementing projects as a co-steward, like, what does that look like? How much in your experience is NPS? Like, I guess what I'm trying to ask is, like, is it more inductive or is it deductive methodologies? And then like what, I don't know. I'm just wondering overall, what does like co-stewardship mean in your experience, and how do people negotiate those inherent power dynamics, right? Which are always going to favor NPS.
Yeah. No, I think that's a good point. And I'm going to pull up another report here too and drop this in products. Here it is. Okay.
Sorry if that was a confusing question.
No, I got you. So here's the thing. I think as a federal employee, we're already in a position of power. And as the land manager, we're already in a position of power over and in any relationship that we're talking about. And we just have to be aware of that. And I think that's one of the skills that I think anthropologists can bring to the table, is sort of that self-awareness of inherent power dynamic or bias that we have, right? The way that I usually say things is like, the Park Service is happens to be the land manager today over lands that were whatever, lands that were tribal, lands that were indigenous, lands that were burial grounds for other peoples or other communities. But Park Service is the land manager today. So inherent in that is a responsibility to understand what that relationship is and what the people's relationship is to the resources that we manage today. And that to me is like if we do nothing else, if we can help somebody understand, if we can help a superintendent or somebody who came from, say, a law enforcement background or administrative background or something like that, if we can help them understand that there is this deeper value system that traditionally associated people have, and that it brings value to the planning that the Park Service is doing. It's not that you, not only do you just need to understand it, but there's value to that perspective. The anthropologist is often in that place of walking in the two worlds, right? Trying to understand and interpret an organizational culture to a traditionally associated group, and trying to understand that traditionally associated group's culture and interpret it for the managers of, you know, the agency. And so you're kind of weaving in between those two places, those roles. So I would say we've been doing this a long time, and I think it is valuable, and I think it's and in fact, I think that in recent years, it's almost, other people are doing it too. They're calling it different things like relevancy, diversity, and inclusion, and, you know, other things. There's lots of people that are doing, you know, trying to help gain this kind of perspective. So one of the links that I dropped in there about co-stewardship is, you know, tribes in particular, and some tribe, you know, some specific areas, tribes are like, you know, co-management is what they would prefer. Co-management is an equal power authority. That's implied in co-management, is that, and where we have it in particular at Grand Portage National Monument, the land that park is on, it was created from acres that were transferred by the tribe to the federal government to create the park. So it's in the middle of the reservation, and it was set up as a co-managed park from day one. And when you talk to the superintendent there, they will say, there's no, like, you can't tell the difference between who's paying what salary. Is it the tribe paying the salary or Park Service paying the salary? The tribe does all of the maintenance at the park. All the maintenance staff are tribal. The tribal headquarters and the park headquarters are conjoined, you know, so that there's a different situation going on there. Co-stewardship is that sort of different level where the Park Service is still the manager, still the responsible party, is still the one that has to get the budget and the money to try and do the work. The co-stewardship aspect comes in when you say, what are the things that we can do together? What are the common interests that we have? And, you know, what does the partner want to bring to the table? What does the tribe want to bring to the table? The link that I dropped in is for a report. I don't know, it's kind of like a magazine. I don't know what you would call it. It's a document that we put together. It took us a long time, but the Park Service is part of this international collaboration of wild places with Canada, Parks Canada, and CONOP, which is the Mexican government's Parks Association. And several years ago, we wanted to do a paper about working with Indigenous peoples in Canada, the United States, and Mexico. And so our article that we have in there for the Park Service was for Redwoods National Park and the Yorick tribe, which they have a co-stewardship agreement that they've developed over many years in the restoration of condors. And that whole agreement, I mean, it's been over a decade that the park and the tribe have been working together for condor restoration. And that started because the tribes had the experience. The tribe had been doing condor restoration on tribal lands, and they wanted to expand the restoration areas, thinking at a large landscape scale or an ecosystem scale. And so they wanted to expand that into a larger landscape, into ancestral lands. And so they reached out to the federal parks and the state parks. And so that partnership is actually very big between federal, state, tribal on co-stewardship of condor restoration. And in fact, I've asked Tiana is with the Yorick tribe and the former deputy superintendent there. They came to one of the SFAA panels and did a presentation about that partnership. I think they were at Portland when we were there. So that is an example of, the tribe came to the table with the knowledge and the experience on how to do it, and they were looking to expand the influence in support of condor restoration. And so they brought in the state and the federal parks into the mix, and off it went. Now, it's complicated. It takes a lot of time to build those relationships. It takes a lot of time to understand how to do the agreements, to do the funding, to think about protocols and communication. But I think that's an interesting article you can read through there and see another example of how this comes to play.
Thank you so much. That was an amazing answer.
Yeah. What else? What other questions?
I have one.
Okay.
And this is more since we're talking about the African American program there at was it Monocacy?
Yep.
So here at Vicksburg, this is kind of like contested space where there's been since the Civil War, there's been a battle over at the cemetery over what groups were allowed to celebrate Memorial Day or 4th of July or freedom dates. So in my program, and we are doing, because the cemetery collapsed, so there is an archaeological component going on now, and they're going to do some DNA testing. What strategies do you have for me? Not that there's going to be any co-stewardship happening here, but to help maybe the African American community embrace the space that has had this white lost cause narrative that's kind of pushed them away in the last several decades.
Yeah. So there's a couple of things that are going on. Like for one thing, I just want to say cemeteries are really an important topic, and burial grounds. So there's so many things, I guess, to talk about, but the management policies has some really good language in management policies about burial grounds and cemeteries and how we manage them. So I always tell people to go back to management policies. I'll drop a link in there too. I just had it open right before we started talking, and look at those sections, because it helps to guide what we can do and what we can't do, like we can't enlarge national cemeteries, for example. And there's director's orders about how we manage those places, and especially national cemeteries. They have their own, management. They have their own director's order on how you manage those. We also have other types of burial grounds that we manage in the National Park Service. So, so that's one thing I'll say. And we are working on a new policy memo, which will hopefully come out by the end of this year, about NAGPRA. So for those of you that are familiar with NAGPRA, Native American Graves Protection and Repatriation Act, we can do reburials in parks if remains came from the park or were repatriated by the Park Service. But we get requests sometimes from tribes to rebury items that were not from the park. And there's a waiver process. The superintendents can ask for a waiver to management policies in order to do that. And we're just trying to clarify that process. So we've been thinking a lot about cemeteries lately, and the African American burial grounds, there's a new program that was authorized in the omnibus legislation last fall, but there is from Congress, but there's no appropriation yet. So it's an authorized program that has not begun yet because there was no money. Congress did not appropriate any funds to it. So it's sort of sitting out there. But that is a program that's going to sit in cultural resources of the National Park Service, probably on our grant side. It's primarily going to be a granting program. And the intention of that program was to help mostly local non-federal lands local municipalities and local communities that discover burial grounds, and what do we do? You know, what do we do with this? How do we consult appropriately? How do we locate them? So, you know, if they're located, how do we document that location if that's appropriate? So that if that gets funds in the FY24 budget, we'll see what happens. If that gets funds, then we will that program will start to be stood up in the next probably year or more. All of that being said, there are a lot of people. I mean, you're at Vicksburg. Colonial's been doing good consultation work with African American descendant communities for several years. The manager at Monticello is Yola Dance, and I've known Yola for a long time. And she is an excellent person to help with reaching out to communities. She came from the Park Service, and she's now not with Park Service, but with Monticello. I think the best approach to try and, you know, part of this, you know, part of these kinds of questions is trying to understand the context in its whole. You know, what's the whole context of this contested space? What are these people's interests? You know, what are they looking for? What are the common denominators? What are the things that we agree on? And who in the community could be good people to reach out to if it hasn't been a good relationship thus far? And so people like Yola and, you know, some of the other folks that have been working at Colonial, they might be good references to kind of ask that question and sort of see who has been a part of these conversations. It's not something to just sort of dive into and say, you know, I'm here now and I'm gonna just start calling up people, and, you know, you definitely want to understand that background first, I think. But yeah, there's stuff out there to help.
Thank you.
Yeah. I see what you're saying there. I'm gonna send the slides as a PDF to you guys, because it should preserve all the links that are in the slides. Yes.
I have one more question, but I just want to make sure I'm not taking up time from other people. So is it okay if I ask? Okay. So I mentioned this in a meeting before, so sorry to everyone else who's heard me ask this already. But so as you probably know, at least for like my research, I had to do an IRB and do all of ethical training. And so as far to my knowledge, there isn't that process in NPS, right? So I'm just wondering if you could elucidate a little bit about, for projects you've done, or like if any of us want to do ethnographic interviewing or like collect data that we're going to be donating to our sites or to NPS, like the cultural resources inventory system you talked about, what is the process for like consent? Like, is there an internal system within NPS of like submitting our interview guides, or you know, what overview process is there, if any? And then also, does the NPS, at least in recent years, it's more and more common to like compensate or engage in some type of reciprocity with people who participate in these ethnographic projects? Like, how, in your experience, do y'all approach that? You know, where maybe, I don't know, what method systems do you use to track that, essentially?
Yeah. And I think, Eleanor, I sent you some stuff in an email a few months ago, it seems like, perhaps, and that could be something that we could just sort of reshare out again with people. But I'll just let folks know. I just dropped in there the link to the anthropology page that has the regional anthropologists. And so I would say if you're going to be doing, I know that some of you have already talked to like David Goldstein in Northeast region, Kim Greenwood is in Intermountain region, Mike Evans is in the Midwest region, Jason Lyons is in Pacific West region for your Anza Trail folks. So I think that some of you have already talked to some of those people about the research, and I think that's the best, that'd be my best recommendation to help get started. There is no human subject review board in the federal government. And we have talked about this at a different level, at sort of the departmental level and others. We've talked about, should we try to establish some kind of IRB version? It's complicated, but I work with Brett Meldrum, and he is the manager of the social sciences program for the National Park Service. And the social sciences program is sort of another arm. They do the visitor use surveys, and they do other type of qualitative research. And they're the ones that manage the Paperwork Reduction Act, or the OMB review and approval process. So he and I, we're kind of the same mind. Ethnographic research, if we are working with a researcher that is with an academic institution and the academic institution requires IRB review or human subject review, then we just support them as they go through that process. And then we just like a copy of that IRB, review approval or human subject review approval. And so if it's required for them as a partner, like through the CESU or whoever, then we would take a copy of that. For our purposes, we have consent forms for interviews that are a standard form, although people have made some modifications over the years. And I think I might have shared that, but we can share that. And the regional staff have it. So everybody that you interview should have a signed consent form, and you should have a copy, and they should have a copy. And that consent form needs to actually have informed consent. So I always say, you need to have something else with that form, like you need to have a briefing or an overview of the project, or something that is informing them of what you're asking and why you're interviewing them. So usually there's some kind of a overview, project overview or something, and then there's the consent form. We in anthropology do semi-structured interviews and snowball interviewing. So we are not asking a standard set of questions, and we're not doing surveys. And if we ask them of less than 10 people, then you do not need to get OMB review and approval. But if you ask more than 10 people, and if you are going to do a survey, or you're going to do like a focus group or something like that, you will need to get OMB review and approval. And that's where it sidesteps over to Brett's shop and the PRA folks. It's taking 1.5 years to get OMB review and approval, which is why I always tell people this is very like, that's not what we do in ethnography. We're trying not to do those things that are going to be standardized, large groups of people, the public, all of that stuff is the thing that puts you over the edge in needing OMB review. And as I've told them many times, if we had to do that in the anthropology program for every ethnographic project that we did, we would never get any work done, because we don't, our funding comes on an annual basis. We wouldn't even get the approval in the year that we got the funding. That's just crazy. So again, he and I have been talking about this a lot, but that's why I want you to, know who your regional anthropologist is, and if you have questions about it. But if you're just going to talk to a few people and you're going to just ask questions about whatever your project is, and there's a difference between a conversation and an interview, just sort of think about how you're scoping this out. And if we want to, if people get into their projects and you want to have some more detailed conversations, either with the regional anthropologist or with me or with both of us, we can, we could set up a separate call for that. But those are just some things to be aware of. If it's a project, and it needs some structure to it, then you probably do need to have informed consent and a consent form that they sign and along with it. Now, as far as compensation, it really depends on the project and it depends on what you're asking for. So in general, we don't compensate people for participating in ethnographic research. If we are asking for something specific, like we have a subject matter expert and we're going to ask them for, this is where you get into kind of that co-development arm. So if there's somebody specific that has a certain part of expertise and you're asking them to do something for your project, you're going to be co-developing something, or they're a subject matter expert and they're going to need to write something for you, or they're going to review something or whatever, then you might want to consider compensation. And compensation, I always tell people the good rule of thumb for compensation is what is the equivalent of the other professionals in the room, right? So if the other professionals in the room are roughly like a GS9 or a GS11 or something like that, then look at the GS, look at the wage rate for your area. It's all online, and you can come up with an hourly rate, and you can work with it that way. Some of the regions also have, for like cultural demonstrations or this kind of thing, sometimes they have a cap. So maybe it's $500 a day or $300 a day or something like that. So again, the regional anthropologist will have a better sense of how they generally work with compensation. The park can pay through a variety of ways for that, including buy a credit card for professional services if that's what is going to happen. But so that's not just like an interview. That's where they're actually a subject matter expert kind of involved in your project a little bit deeper.
Again, thank you for the wonderful answer.
Sure.
We have just about 5 minutes left in this meeting, and I will send the email. Jennifer had sent me an email earlier in the year with some resources, and I will forward that to everyone. Any other questions in our final 5 minutes that we have just for right now? Starting our conversation with the anthropology program.
Can I put Michelle on the spot here and just ask her what anthropology that she has planning on going on at her park?
Sure. Hi, Beth.
Hi.
We are planning on doing some these survivor interviews. There are only a couple boarding school survivors that we're aware of, and they're very elderly. But we would like to set up interviews with them if they're willing. I know Lauren's working on one, and we've just become aware of the other one. We just presented at a conference last week, and in our best practices, it does say that we'll be compensating for interviews. I think that's just more of a kind of respect thing. I know it's newer. I know it's not usually done in anthropology, but that's just what our team decided to do. When it comes to like IRB stuff, I guess I just kind of planned on, we're all just going to kind of work on a consent form. We would also have talked about doing listening sessions with the public. I'm not sure if that would be qualify as a focus group or
Mhm.
if since it's a little less structured, we can get away without going through approval for that. But I am really looking forward to those. And then, of course, I've already been involved in tribal consultation a few times since starting my job. And one of the typos was at our conference last week. So we're, the ball's rolling fast, it seems like. So that's exciting. Is that specific enough? Is that what you were wondering?
I was just kind of wondering what was going on up there, so I'm kind of interested. So yeah,
Well, yeah, anybody that wants to talk, like email me or ask me in the chat. I was out of town all last week, but I would love to talk to you guys about it.
I also just dropped a link into the chat again for the oral history program for the Park Service. So if you haven't spoken to her, Luann Jones is the oral historian. She's in the Park History program. She's fantastic. She and I have done a couple of trainings together where she did oral history stuff and I did ethnography stuff, and really kind of just talked about the distinction, right? It's really about the purpose, so oral history is kind of for for history's sake. The ethnography is generally about bigger, broader context, you know, a a bigger picture kind of a thing. So, but it's it's the same kind of tool, right? Oral history as a tool in our toolbox of it's just kind of what is behind it, what's the intention, but we use the same methods and forms and everything. But Luann's great. So there's a link there too for you guys if you're thinking about oral history. And we all use the same kind of methods and interview forms and stuff like that. So she does trainings.
Yeah, we spoke with Luann
Good.
last week. Yeah.
Oh,
and
good. Excellent.
I think it's good to just see the two programs in conversation with each other. And I think as folks' work moves forward, I'm sure they'll be in touch with both you and Luann. And this summer, actually, the resources that you had shared related to intellectual property coming out of interviews or anthropology or even oral history projects. So I will share those also. That the Northeast region has been making some, I guess, headway on thinking through how to intellectual property and how to protect that. I know Michelle Lauren had been in touch with me about that, and I sent those resources to Lauren too, so she has them, I think, on hand. So
yeah, it's a challenge, and that's the thing that people struggle with the most on our consent form for the interviews is, people's intellectual property. Where is it actually intellectual property, and where, how do we protect that, and how do we acknowledge that? So yeah, I mean, this is not unique to the Park Service, right? This is what everybody's doing right now, is just trying to be sensitive and aware and appropriate and all of those things. So yeah, it's good. Yeah, you guys, I see in the chat there. Yeah, you can either schedule more time for individual. It might be easier if you have specific things, that you want to talk about. We can talk about that in the future. Happy to support you guys. You're doing really interesting work. So and on a timeline. So I understand that too. I've worked with fellows many times. So
well, thanks so much, Jennifer, for your time today. All we were recording this session, so the links that Jennifer put in the chat will be in the recording. You can access those. And I will share the email that I mentioned. And thanks again so much. And definitely, as Jennifer said, reach out to your cultural anthropologist in your region also with any more specific questions. So thank you again so much. I really appreciate it.
absolutely. Thanks, everybody.
Bye.
If you are going to SFAA, be sure and let me know in the spring so that we can have you on an email group and get together while we're all out there. All right. Thanks, everybody. Have a really good day. Happy Halloween if you're a Halloween person.
Thanks.
Okay.
Bye.
Bye.